Kant brought about a revolution in our understanding of the mind by recognizing the essentially normative character of the discursive. In a decisive break with the Cartesian tradition, he distinguishes judgments and intentional actions from the responses of non-discursive creatures, not ontologically, by their supposed involvement with an ultimately spooky kind of mental substance, but deontologically, as things their subjects are in a distinctive way responsible for. What we believe and what we do express commitments of ours. They're exercises of a kind of authority distinctive of discursive creatures. Responsibility, commitment, authority, these are all normative statuses. Concepts which articulate discursive acts of judging and intentionally doing, Kant says, are rules. They're rules that determine what we've made ourselves responsible for, what we've committed ourselves to, what we've invested our authority in. Appreciating the rulishness, the normative character of the mind, this is Kant's normative turn. Practically, what we're responsible for and committed to doing in investing our authority in how things are or ought to be, Kant thinks, is having reasons for those commitments. What our concepts or rules for doing is reasoning. It's the concepts articulating the contents of our judgments and intentions that determine what count as reasons for and against thinking or acting that way, what would entitle us to do so, or justify us in taking on commitments with those conceptual contents. For Kant, as discursive creatures, we live and move and have our being in a normative space of reasons. After Descartes, the challenge was to find a place for mental stuff in a natural world of physical stuff. After Kant, the challenge became finding a place for norms in a natural world. Descartes had been roundly criticized for his dualism of minds and bodies. The danger is that the result of Kant's revolutionary insight into the normativity of intentionality would be to replace that dualism with a dualism of norm and fact. Now, I take it that a distinction becomes a dualism when it's drawn in terms that make the relation between the distinguished items ultimately unintelligible. I'll argue that the collision between the possibility of global genealogies and understanding ourselves as rational depends on a set of assumptions, which I'm going to gather together under the rubric of semantic naivety, that would turn Kant's distinction into a dualism, but also that those assumptions are optional and indeed incorrect. I'll argue further that Hegel, intense and insightful reader of Kant that he was, already understood all this and offered a constructive alternative that can provide a way forward for us in thinking about these issues today. Kant's normative turn expressed an insight in discursive pragmatics, our understanding of what we're doing in judging and acting intentionally. He also moved beyond the Cartesian tradition he inherited in seeing that its characteristic epistemological concerns raised a more fundamental semantic question. His idea here was that if we properly understood what it is for our thoughts to be representations, in the sense of so much as purporting to represent something, the epistemological skeptical question of what reason we have to think that they ever correctly represent something would be revealed on semantic grounds to be ill-posed. Hegel saw, however, that as penetrating as these archaeological semantic excavations were, Kant failed fully to appreciate and address a crucial semantic question raised by his original normative pragmatic idea. Kant correctly saw that judging and acting intentionally are exercises of authority that come with correlative responsibilities, commitments to having reasons for and acknowledging consequences of those undertakings. Kant already understood concepts as functions of judgment, in the sense of rules that determine what would count as a reason for applying those concepts in judgment and what the further consequences of doing so are. In a strict sense, all Kantian rational creatures can do is apply concepts in judging and acting. So those discursive activities presuppose the availability of the concepts they deploy. But that presupposition raises in turn the question faced by Kant's rationalist hero Leibniz. Where do those concepts come from? How do we get access to them? Once the discursive enterprise is up and running, new concepts can be formed downstream from applications of old ones, e.g. by Kant's judgments of reflection. But what's the origin of the concepts that make empirical and practical discursive activity possible in the first place? Hegel reads Kant as having a two-stage story. Transcendental activity is the source of the conceptual norms that then govern empirical discursive activity. The empirical self accordingly always already finds itself with a stock of determinate concepts. The transcendental processes by which discursive norms are instituted are sharply distinguished from the empirical processes in which those discursive norms are then applied. In the 20th century, Rudolf Carnap provides an index example of this Kantian two-stage semantic epistemic explanatory strategy. In his version, the two stages correspond to beginning by fixing meanings and only then going on to fix beliefs. The first, semantic stage, is selecting a language. The second, epistemic stage, is selecting a theory, a set of sentences couched in that language that are taken to be true. His student Quine objected to Carnap that while this two-stage procedure makes perfect sense for formal or artificial languages, it makes no sense for natural languages. All speakers do is use the language, Kant would say, to make judgments. That use must somehow determine both what their expressions mean and which sentences they take to be true. In the vocabulary I use to talk about Kant, the use of language to express judgments must be understood as affecting both the institution of conceptual norms and their application. Two-stage stories about the division of labor between semantics and epistemology, that is, about the relation between conceptual contents and their application in judgment, are committed to semantic purity. This is the view that the contents concepts possess are not at all affected by the use of those concepts in making judgments, in believing a particular subset of the universe of believables. That's the point of having a first semantogenic stage at which contents are determined, conceptual norms are instituted, before the second stage, comprising the application of concepts in taking things to be thus and so, to be as represented by some already contentful representings and not others. Commitment to semantic purity is commitment to the possibility of pursuing semantics independently of commitment to how things actually are. The thought is that epistemic commitments are not to contaminate semantic ones. Semantic commitments are necessary conditions only for the expression of epistemic ones. On this picture, two independent elements combine to make epistemic commitments, true claims. Semantic commitments, picking a language, settling on contentful concepts, and how the world is. And the second element is simply irrelevant to the first. Now, semantic purity is not an unintelligible idea. It makes sense in the context of stipulating associations of semantic interpretants with linguistic expressions for artificial languages by a theorist working in a semantically more powerful meta-language. But semantic naivete results when one believes that semantic purity is intelligible for an autonomous intentional stratum, for natural languages, or for thought in general. Quine objects to the semantic naivete of commitment to the possibility of pure semantics, and in this regard makes common cause with the later Wittgenstein. Both thinkers take it that all there is to confer content on our expressions is the way those expressions are used, paradigmatically in making claims and forming beliefs, that is, in committing ourselves to how things are. Two-stage theories about the division of semantic and epistemological labor for natural languages and the thoughts they express, Quine and Wittgenstein think, are bound to invoke semantic stories about the first stage that make the notion of conceptual content ultimately magical. They're committed to semantic purity. So, when applied to natural languages and thought, they're semantically naive. This is exactly Hegel's complaint about Kant. He was uncharacteristically but culpable uncritical about the source and nature of determinate conceptual contents. In this regard, at least, Hegel stands to Kant as Quine does to Carnap. And like Quine and Wittgenstein, Hegel offers an ultimately pragmatist account of how using a natural language can be intelligible as both instituting and applying conceptual norms. This line of thought bears directly on the issue I started off by considering. For global genealogical reductive explaining away of norms in favor of attitudes presumes that it's intelligible for the contents of propositional attitudes to stay in place after normative reason relations among their judgeable contents are relinquished. Otherwise, what's being explained genealogically can no longer be understood as believings, as attitudes of taking things to be thus and so. If our attitudes were not genuinely conceptually contentful, then we would not be even purporting to represent things as being thus and so. Things would not even seem to us to be thus and so. If disillusionment about the reality of norms of reasoning entails semantic nihilism, then it's self-defeating. The genealogist's claims would entail that her own claims are senseless. The overall point I want to make is that taking the contents of propositional attitudes in general to be independent of the government of those attitudes by norms concerning what genuinely is a reason for what presupposes a semantically naive two-stage account of the division of semantic and epistemic labor.
That was awe-inspiring, and I'm sure I understand only a small piece of it. The piece I did understand was the reference to law, and I was wondering about that because it seemed to make the case for Hegel worse. I realize you're presenting Hegel's vision rather than defending it, but there are very few lawyers today who would accept the romantic teleological story you told about law, that as judges work through the common law, they work at pure. That's the old trope. Even Dworkin, I think, would have taken that as a kind of sentimental conceit. And I think what most people thinking about law would say is that sort of story is a necessary piece of the legitimation of law, the sociological legitimation of law. It works as a kind of hard constraint to impose some external controls on what judges do, but not even the earliest of the legal realists, what the judge had for breakfast guys, thought that judges just threw up their hands and awarded damages to themselves. The point was that the concepts were highly underdeterminative, but that there was some determination by these concepts, but basically the work of singling out who won and who lost in a particular case was explained genealogically. And that we had to tell this progressive story. This progressive story came from outside. It came from the needs of power to justify a system that, by and large, served those interests. And I think that's the worry that one would throw back on Hegel, that this progressivism comes externally. It's a legitimation story. It makes us feel good about ourselves, about the nature of the concepts we have, but it's ultimately a myth about the contingencies we have.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that if that were the story I was attributing to Hegel, it would be subject to all those criticisms. I think instead you can see it as articulating the normative fine structure of what Dworkin calls the judge's chain novels. And what distinguishes the Hegelian story, which I was really just able to wave my hands at here, but which in other places I have written about more extensively, is that it's not that he thinks that there are secreted in the tradition some norm which is gradually getting all the pieces of that, except the pieces that are of that statue, are being chipped away by each decision, and the already present statue is being found. Rather, he thinks each judge has to tell a story like that. That's the only form of rationalization, the only form of a reason you can give for making one judgment rather than another, is to find that rationale implicit in the decisions that have been made before. But the very next judge's story may be radically different about what is progressive. The trajectory that he discerns, which again is, as far as he picks out the precedents, expressively progressive and cumulative and monotonic. Each precedent that he picks out is revealing some aspect that he's appealing to, but its relation to the rationale that the previous judge told may be radically different. And so Hegel sees sort of at each stage when we ask, well, what is the content of this concept? We've got to understand it as a snapshot of something that is being shaped in a process of this description. And I read him as thinking that that's what we should be doing for our philosophical predecessors as well, that he told one story in the Phenomenology and in the History of Philosophy about what each philosopher had discovered, such that if you put all these things together, you got to the system, to his account. And I read him as thinking that it's our job to do quite a different one and say, oh, well, yes, and the piece that he got was this, and he misunderstood Leibniz, and so on. So the romantic picture that you were properly rejecting, I think, is one that isn't looking at this prospective discontinuities, the radical discontinuities between the retrospective Whiggish stories. He thinks that telling stories like that is the form of reason's march through history, but that in principle, that process of determining the content of concepts involves also these radical discontinuities.